everything about the way in which women asserted themselves in positions behind the scenes, even though they couldn't vote and even though they couldn't run for office. Everything about the way in which men's votes were being contested and ripped away from them and disenfranchised. For me, it's a microcosm in history. It's a micro story, a micro history about how the ties that bind a civic society unravel.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I take us immediately to 95 BCE, the birth of a young woman who becomes a centerpiece of a wonderful new half-situation comedy, half-murder tragedy. The book is Clodia, Champion of the Republic. It's about an extremely well-born child who becomes the center of a drama that we know as Julius Caesar. But this is approaching the same story with almost all the same cast from the point of view of a young woman who grows up to marry and be proper as long as her husband lives, Clodia. Her last name tells a story also of her patronage, the Appian Way, or the aqueduct that feeds Rome. I welcome the author, Douglas Boin, a classicist, professor in St. Louis. And it's important here to follow this story from the point of view of not Caesar, who passes through many of these scenes, not Pompey, Caesar's rival. Nothing that we recognize, including the murder of Caesar, is essential to the understanding of how we get to the drama that we know as the Roman Civil War. Douglas, Professor, congratulations. This is wonderful.
And it's a pleasure. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I did jump the gun there for a second, but absolutely a pleasure to be back, John. Thank you for the praise.
Born 95 BCE. Who is Clodia? What is her family to her? Good evening to you.
Good evening. She's a wonderfully privileged young girl from a family of 6 siblings who grew up in the center of Rome in one of the most exclusive addresses that you could have in the city. There were always kind of a house full of staff and slaves to polish the dishware, the dinnerware, and clean the dishware. And her family and her great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather can trace their lineage back to the founding of the Republic. So she had an amazing, I think, childhood growing up, because every day she walked by the family tree in her house that was painted on the wall. She got to see a line of ancestors that took her story back to the beginnings of Rome. And there's very few families in Rome that could get away with doing that.
Let's do real estate, Douglas, because, of course, the Wall Street Journal gives us imaginary mansions every day that people live in. She lives on the Palatine Hill. What does that represent to a Roman family?
To a Roman family of Clodia's day, you have to imagine noise in the city, I think. So you've got the quays down at the river where the ceramics are constantly being offloaded, the olive oil containers. You've got the cart traffic and the foot traffic all around and through the Forum. You've got the regular residents of Rome living in 4-story, 5-story apartment complexes. This is a grungy city, certainly lacking any kind of open square, the way that we associate the modern piazza with modern Italy. And there's no huge boulevards. There's no kind of, clean thoroughfares that would define the later empire of Rome. And in this landscape, this kind of dirty, gritty, noisy landscape, the Appius family, Clodia's family, found a plot of land on Palatine Hill, which is in the center of the city, a green, leafy, kind of shaded enclave that hosted, neighbor by neighbor down the street, some of the most well-heeled families of the Roman Republic. And we can pretty much go block by block and chart the names of folks that were heads of state, that were, the Pontifex Maximus, that were famous senators. And this was a place for her and her family. I think her parents probably, really put an emphasis on having a place where their child could run in the backyard and just feel kind of carefree. And that was a luxury, to be carefree. And that's where she grew up.
She and one of her brothers changed their names from Claudia to Clodia, the unusual spelling, from Claudius to Clodius, as I suppose an act of independence from their family's weight. So
It,
we'll accept that, although it's a puzzle why they together were they bonded in some fashion in defiance in the family?
Politically, we have a sense that their interests, kind of their voting policy interests, went a different direction than their father. And we'll probably get into this in one of the next segments. But for a long line in their family, the family had kind of prided itself on this very famous motto that it always used as a kind of shorthand for a kind of family crest. Everyone crafts their own future. Everyone crafts his own future. And that seems to have been internalized by her and her brother very much so, in relationship to their dad, who, at one very difficult point in the politics of the Roman Republic, made a kind of accommodation to a kind of creeping radical in power that the siblings seem to rebel against. So that adolescent rebellion is probably at the heart of the reason why the siblings chose to spell their names differently. It was a way to kind of reclaim the family's long agency of being independent.
We move from Clodia, the independent minded, well born young woman, to Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, who is not from a famous family. He's not up to Mates at all. Born 106 and is a principal in many of the dramas that we know as the build up to the Roman Civil War. What do we know about his childhood that left him so flexible? Today we would call him a climber. Did they call him that then?
He's a fascinating character to me. I think he's I think many of your listeners and certainly the people who know the Republic well would expect him to be the protagonist in a story of this sort. And what was kind of fun for me as a writer historian was to make him kind of secondary to some of the underlying narrative. And I think this goes against everything in his body. His every bone in his body was not to be second fiddle. He had grown up kind of on the marginal world of Rome, but it was fascinating to kind of condense his biography into the middle narrative, that kind of act 3 of the story, because he starts out as just someone who recognizes he has talent as a public speaker. He is good at defending folks who are kind of facing injustices that are obvious and patent to juries. And he becomes well liked and well sought out in the public sphere because he has that talent and that flair for language when he can deliver it. And it's from there that he marries his wife, and with her funds is able to kind of create the pool of money that he needs to start a political career, and launches his path into higher office, until eventually becomes, like, everyone pretty much knows him as consul of Rome. I loved kind of tracing that story from the kind of outside of Rome through just using his raw words. He had a wordsmith nature to him that was he was a ceaseless kind of reviser. He kind of practiced the folksiness in front of juries, and I really imagined the way that Romans liked him when they first encountered him. And it was important to kind of tell all of that in the book, because that's not where his story ends.
Yes, he's got a magic tongue. You mentioned marriage, so he marries the wonderful Terentia. In Rome, every throne had a woman in front of it, but we've lost a lot of those letters. Terentia is very well to do and believes in Cicero's talent. Claudia marries Metellus, who is a little older than she, and they have a stormy marriage. So whereas Cicero, a man of, well, I think of him as a Swiss Army knife of a tongue. He can go in any direction. He can do anything. He marries well, and Terentia is devoted to him, and he to her from the letters you give us, Douglas. But Claudia's marriage to Metellus is a failure right away, and they argue in public. However, she has politics, and we need to attend to those politics to understand a sitcom of powerful, well-to-do, and eventually extremely wealthy women mixing in with the men whom we know as Julius Caesar's accomplices. Claudia, champion of the Republic. The politics here are critical. This is the end of the Republic and the transition to Augustus, to the empire that we still celebrate and think about and worry about and look for analogies in 2,100 years later. But the politics of the moment, forgive me, Professor, I'm simplifying, so you can do it more, you can parse it better. The populares were the regular people, the the people, the plebes, and
The people,
the
yeah,
optimists were the Senate. Those are the two big categories. How did they interrelate? Did they relate?
no, I think you're right here. We've got these two words, the optimates, the so-called best men, and we've got the populares, who are, I think, the people's party. And using these words, if we went into, a space of specialists just for a second between you and me, everyone would start raising their hands and start kind of calling foul and pulling out red flags, because it's very difficult to understand how the Romans are describing their society in the first century, and it's difficult sometimes to separate the layers that we put on it 2,000 years later to make it intelligible. No one had a kind of party boss. There were no, the way we would have like a party structure system of picking candidates and running them on a platform. What we have are really just two broad buckets of interests, the people's interests and kind of more aristocratic interests. And what that means is that demographically across society, at any one point in time, there's going to be people who pick and choose what side or what politician to support. Basically, the way of saying this in shorthand from an analytical point today is that in Rome, there was probably no single issue voter. We'll put it that way. So you could find quite aristocratic families supporting people's issues on one hand, and you might find people from, unexpected realms of the Italian peninsula supporting the Roman establishment. And what we're kind of really talking about when we get into the core of what some of the issues are as follows: debt relief, support for veterans who have fought in foreign wars, things like constitutional government reform, like ways to stop obstruction in the Senate. Those are really where the fault lines will come. So that kind of sketches the politics, I hope, the way that you were prompting.
Claudia marries Metellus. Metellus becomes a politician of the Senate,
Mhm.
a consul. Where, on the other hand, Cicero pays great attention as a lawyer to rich clients. He's a man who's not unsympathetic to both sides. He doesn't have one commitment. That's why he's so magical. But Clodia and her younger brother Clodius find a way to have power young, because there's some certain age categories that the younger brother, Clodius, doesn't satisfy. And the way is through the tribunes. What are the tribunes to the Senate, Professor?
When I was going and trying to translate some of these offices for kind of modern readers who may or may not have a kind of deep knowledge of Rome's constitutional structure, so to speak. It was important to figure out how to make these terms intelligible. And I went back to Robert Graves, which is kind of an odd thing for a historian to say, maybe, because he was such a great, enthusiastic writer of fiction and such a kind of colorful fiction writer. But I went back to I Claudius, and he has this wonderful translation of the Tribune as an office. He calls it the people's protector, and that just he kind of saw that this was the right translation. It was an office that was really meant to represent the interests of everyone outside of the Senate. So shorthand, we might say a kind of it was kind of the board of 10 or that worked as kind of a representative body versus the kind of more elite interest of the Senate. And they had a very specific constitutional tool to use in passing legislation called the veto. And they were the only office in the Roman Republic that could veto anything. Not even the chief executives, the consuls, had a veto power. So the tribunes had claimed this power over a long history of constitutional evolution in Rome to make sure that the state worked for everyone, and that's a kind of pie in the sky ideal, and how that works on any one year is going to depend upon the charisma of the people in power. But by and large, the people who run for tribune have the best interests of a kind of wider net of Roman society in their lens, as opposed to the Senate, which might just be very specifically focused on passing legislation that helps its own members. And what we know is that Clodia and her brother angled to have him run for people's protector, and he won.
And he becomes a tribune who wants to reform the way Rome conducts its business. Cicero, on the other hand, rises to become consul at some point, and certainly a voice that is very well known in the Senate. So Cicero represents the optimates. Claudia and her brother Claudius represent the tribune, though they are optimates. That sets up the clash that we know at a murder trial that happens some years hence. It's important to mention here that what we're seeing are the same scenes that Caesar saw, that Pompey saw, that Crassus saw, and Mark Antony saw, the same scenes, but we're not including them. They're not the principles of these things. But the action that we're about to reveal sets up the drama that is the assassination of Caesar. His new book is Clodia, Champion of Rome. Clodia, born 95, has a younger brother who's ambitious and leads the tribunes to correct and reform the Roman conduct at the time of their maturity. Claudia, our heroine, loses her husband suddenly. After he's consul, he dies 4 months later. Metellus is gone. She has a daughter, and she's unmarried, but because of a confusion of inheritance laws, which will be corrected later in favor of the men, she inherits not only her father's portion, but of her dowry, but also her husband's estates, and becomes extremely wealthy, not under a mandate to marry right away, doesn't need to. She sponsors her younger brother, the tribune. This leads her to be an independent woman, which is generally understood to be a little outside of the rules book in Rome, but accepted. However, there's a man named Cicero. We've introduced him. He's been consul. He's now a magic voice. You hire him when you're in trouble. He also is obsessed with Clodia. Why? We don't know, do we, Douglas? We don't know what that fascination is for him.
We really don't, and it's hard to admit that we really don't. Plutarch, who was writing much later, and always has the colorful vignettes that we expect to find in a Shakespearean play, says that he was obsessed with her in a kind of romantic way, and there's just nothing we can use to document that. But he does seem to have taken quite an interest in her, even at the her husband's inauguration. Um, we get the first inclination, we get the first real hint from Cicero's letters that she's gotten under his skin. He says, "I can't stand the confident airs of that woman," and he won't even say her name. And this is how she enters the history books as a third person, in an unnamed third person that one of her peers can't even, whose name a peer can't even say out loud. So something about her antagonized him, riled him up, and that's fascinating.
The professor is being modest about how he achieved all these facts. It's an enormous jigsaw puzzle, most of which is missing. You can imagine doing a jigsaw puzzle where you get one piece in the midst of a design, but you're never going to get the rest of the design. It's not going to come 2,000 years later. And we have, how does he refer to her? Cow-eyed of Hera. What does that mean to him? Cow-eyed.
Yeah, this is Cicero's phrase in, of the evidence that we do have, because a reader, I'm always sensitive to a reader, I think kind of starts to gloss over the page the more times that a historian says we don't know. So I'm very stingy with admitting on the page what we don't know. I just do the best with what we have and I move on. And one of the richest narratives that I think emerges from what we do have are letters that Cicero has exchanged to a very good friend of his. And over the course of 1 year, 59 BCE, which is a kind of pivotal year for the Republic, Caesar is in charge. Pompey is, behind the scenes. Crassus is lurking. All of the players are here. Cicero is reaching out to his friend and very interested to find out what is being manipulated behind the scenes that might involve him and his potential exile. So something has taken place in Cicero's biography that has put him in legal jeopardy. And this legal jeopardy is looming over his year. It's making him quite anxious. The narrative tone of the letters changes from the beginning of the year to the end of the year as he grows increasingly panicked that someone is going to hold him to account for some legal malfeasance that he's done. And Claudia is the linchpin of the source for what he needs to know. And he's quite disdainful, but also kind of backhanded complimentary to her. He calls her Hera, so he assumes that she's the wife of the king of Mount Olympus. She's all knowing, all seeing, involves herself in every deliberation. That's kind of one part of it. And that's the kind of the cow-eyed Hera quote is Homeric. It's drawn from the Iliad, which gives her this kind of panoptic vision. But it isn't, I don't think, in a straightforward nickname. I think there's something quite derogatory about it for certain. And he won't limit himself to that. When he really gets riled up by her ability to pull strings behind the scenes of the Republic, he accuses her of incestuous relations with her brother in a way that would, for a Roman, equate to the Ptolemies of Egypt. So this is a kind of way to make her foreign, to make her non-Italian, non-Roman. She's like those Greek Egyptian, queens and kings who all sleep with each other. He really, really had an antipathy towards her.
The MacGuffin we're about to talk to. This is what a Hitchcock movie says. Everybody in the drama cares about it, but it's not very important. The MacGuffin here is the murder of a diplomat from Egypt. And a young man named Rufus is accused inferentially for being responsible for the death. Why? Why Rufus? Because Rufus is a young man, ambitious, living in an apartment on Palatine Hill that pays rent to Claudia, now a widow, and a widow who likes romance, has always liked romance. And the assumption is that Rufus, much younger than she, were companions for several years in the real estate that Claudia inherits. She's in the Palatine Hill. She has a house outside, Selenium, the family home. She has a villa at the crater, that's Naples, near Vesuvius. And she has land across the Tiber. She's very rich. And she and Rufus are an item. And then they aren't. One day, Claudia's slaves, the people who work for her, say that Rufus is getting ready to kill her, to poison her, and they declare that he's a threat. Claudia, using her brother Claudius's extreme power at the moment, having exiled Cicero for misbehavior, uh, and all of this is important to prosecute Rufus, and Claudia is going to be the major witness. Now we come to the drama of dramas. Remember, Caesar's watching this, Pompey's watching this, Crassus outside. They're watching this happen because it's a contest between the Senate and the populares. It's between ambitious young woman who is keen on pressing her political power and the establishment that is all male all the time. We come to a courtroom, and the courtroom with 51 jurors on a holiday. Why is that significant, Professor, that they have the trial, so a 2-day trial, you tell me, on a holiday? It's in the forum, right? But nobody's in attendance.
That's exactly right. It's paradoxically so important. The charges that have been bundled under the rubric of sedition are so important that they can be held on a public holiday that paradoxically everyone is at the racetrack watching the games that day when the trial takes place. And this is played to some effect by the defense. I don't think the prosecution ever had a kind of smart understand. I think the prosecution was a little bit tone deaf about how to manage this case. But that's where we are. The You mentioned the MacGuffin. You know, I'm a huge Hitchcock fan. You and I were talking about this in the beginning of the of our Zoom. That kind of ploy to start the train ride and have the protagonists take a kind of cross country escapade. And for me, this trial, the kind of murder of the diplomat, and the reason the book is structured the way that the book is structured from a kind of historical point of view, is quite frankly the true crime element has, I think, been well tested in narrative nonfiction writing as a an easy way to move into complicated, complex social topics. And, instead of kind of telling people from the outset, here is a prequel to the assassination of Julius Caesar, I wanted to do something a little bit more surprising. And so to give people this murder trial that ends up backing into a kind of huge, a kind of scene setting environment for the late first century was important to me.
And it's worthwhile to mention that Cicero is going to. It's the economy of scene is incredible. It's just as if there's a playwright here. Cicero and Claudia are going to be in a courtroom together, and the accused is a former paramour of Claudia. She disdains him now, especially since he might have been trying to poison her. He's associated with the poisoned death of the diplomat from Egypt. All that is a backstory that will turn into Cleopatra and Mark Antony, but that's later. Right now, Mark Antony's also present at a distance here. They're all there. It's incredible. The only one I missed for a while is Octavian. I'm sure he's coming up in the next chapter. So, but the moment that the payoff is Cicero's condemnation of Claudia in order to convince the jury that Rufus would not have done such a thing as murder a diplomat. He's a bright young man who was seduced by an older, wily woman who worships at, whatever disdainful fashion Cicero can call up. His condemnation of Claudia, the professor tells me, is studied for the next 2,000 years. Is that correct, Douglas?
Really is. The We can follow the text of Cicero's speech in front of the jury. We can follow it in Latin from the time it's delivered through the early classrooms of the Roman Empire, when it shows up on papyrus in schoolhouse excavations, through medieval monasteries where it appears in scriptoria of the 8th and 9th century. We can thank Renaissance book hunters like Poggio Bracciolini for detecting traces of it in earlier manuscripts and hunting it down in 12th century France. There are copies that are still in the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. And we can, from there, go directly into the British school system. And quite frankly, we can follow it all the way back to Loyola Academy in Chicago, where as a 16-year-old, I read it. And that text had a remarkable longevity to it. It started my Latin career. It started my kind of interest in classics as a young kid. And it's a kind of it's a challenging text to put it mildly because of how one-sided and lopsided Cicero makes the history and how misogynistic he is towards Claudia. And so really what I wanted to do with the climax of this book was take as much of his words as I could give in translation, in my own translation, and use it in a kind of big moment of revelation that was the climax of her life, not his, and just make sure that we got a different perspective on it than we had for as long as it's been studied.
The payoff is that Cicero gets Rufus off. We believe it's Cicero who convinces the jury that this bright young man who has a great future in front of him wouldn't dare have killed an Egyptian diplomat with poison, nor was he a threat to his former paramour who disdains him and is now condemning him in a fashion that is unworthy of Rome, that kind of thing. Claudia, champion of the Republic. Why that matters is that the Republic is ending as we speak. These scenes are all the last days. Coming up is the Civil War, and after that, Augustus. And we go to 2,000 years later, we're still puzzling about this contest. Cicero has condemned Claudia, and they've used lots of metaphors that are recognizable to them, including Clytemnestra. All of that is behind us now. Claudia disappears. She's there, but she disappears. Claudius, her brother, does not disappear. He becomes a prominent politician until one day, on the road back from Rome, he runs into ruffians led by Milo. Who is Milo, and why is there a fight that breaks out that day, Professor?
This is, we fast forward from the trial a little bit because I wanted to continue the narrative of like you said, this is a story about the Republic, and she is our guide to a kind of major, crucial turning point in it. And where I thought that the most kind of telling end, the most telling conclusion to this chapter in Rome's history would be illuminated, would be with violence spilling out into the street, and certainly Clodius's companions and followers had started they had been given nicknames at one point, Clodiani. These are kind of the hardcore partisans, like the soccer ultras that are kind of loyal to one person and one person's personality only. Milo is someone similar on the opposite political side of things, and the two street gangs clash around 52. At which point, there's swords are drawn and Clodius is stabbed and taken to a nearby tavern where Milo recognizes that he could potentially have his own career derailed for this act of violence, and so decides to finish Clodius off instead of waiting for him to prosecute. And that death leads to the events in the last pages of the book.
Yes, and the events are critical to understand because, again, we're arranging the set for the Roman Civil Wars. We're arranging the set for all that drama that we know through Shakespeare. Claudia is there. We know she's there. We know she's learning these events. We know she's going to mourn her brother, but we don't see her. What we have instead is a treatise on the power that women had at that moment. It's going to be taken from them by the empire. The Republic and women's rights and the rights of people who were north of the Po, who weren't voters at this time. All of that is important to Claudia and her brother Clodius. It always has been, though they're extremely well born. I mean, for heaven's sakes, they have an ancestor who built the Appian Way. I mean, that's Roman prosperity. So, Professor, what I take from your book at this moment is that the Republic was a sponsor of reforms that it would take the next 2,000 years for us to argue about. And I believe we're still arguing about them. Did you feel that way when you were writing this, Douglas?
Absolutely. The pressing political issues for Rome's Republic in Clodia's day are who is allowed to vote, are their votes being manipulated in mathematically so that there might be depressed or they might be kind of arranged and grouped in ways that would suppress popular interests. And can you find a way to incorporate into the civic state the people who live on your borders? In Italy's case, it's the people who live north of the Po River, which is to Italy, Gaul. But to the people of Gaul, they speak Latin. They're part of the Italian peninsula. So everything about the way in which women asserted themselves in positions behind the scenes, even though they couldn't vote and even though they couldn't run for office, everything about the way in which men's votes were being contested and ripped away from them and disenfranchised is for me, it's a microcosm in history. It's a micro story, a micro history about how civic the ties that bind a civic society unravel. And for me, it was always telling the story a cautionary tale, because the point at which violence enters the story is an irrevocable turning point. And some without addressing the issues that need to be addressed. That
Cicero,
happens.
Cicero will have his own fate. We'll leave that to another day. Professor Douglas Boin, he is the author of Clodia, Champion of the Roman Republic. Indeed, she was. And though we only have a few pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, they're a quality lady. I'm John Batchelor.